What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Thursday's Theology. My name is Pastor Jeff. This week we're going to be wrapping up our series on Phase 2 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe by looking at one of the bright spots of the MCU, and that is Ant Man. When this movie first came out, I was a little skeptical of it because Paul Rudd seemed like such a quirky choice to portray Scott Lang. Although, Chris Pratt playing Star-Lord in Guardians of the Galaxy was actually one of the best castings in the entire MCU, so I decided to give Ant Man a shot. And I was not disappointed at all. After seeing Ant Man, it immediately catapulted itself into the top 5 MCU movies. It's an amazing movie. The theology I'd like to explore in Ant Man is the idea of redemption. In many ways, Ant Man parallels the story of the Apostle Paul. For those of you who do not know who the Apostle Paul is, that's okay. He was a Pharisee in the first century, and he was responsible for locking up a lot of Christians. He wasn't born with the name Paul, he was actually born with the name Saul. And not only was he a Pharisee, he was the top Pharisee of his time. The reason that Saul and Scott's story are so similar is because it shows what happens when somebody's story, somebody's character, somebody's identity is redeemed and used for good. This transformative aspect of Ant-Man's story is what we're going to be exploring in this week's episode of Thursday's Theology. Once again, I'm Pastor Jeff. Let's dive in. So I mentioned in the intro this idea of Pharisees, and if for those of you who have no idea what a Pharisee is, don't worry, I'm here to explain. So the Pharisees were a group of Jewish rabbis and legal experts who dedicated their lives to ensuring that the Jewish law was upheld. They were passionate about the law and tried to make sure that every single Jewish person lived out the law. So Saul of Tarsus, who would later be known as the Apostle Paul, was one of these Pharisees. He studied under a rabbi named Gamaliel, who was thought to have been one of the foremost experts of Jewish law and customs. This means that Saul of Tarsus was extremely educated and zealous for the Jewish law. So when Jesus died and rose again, his followers started proclaiming that Jesus was indeed the Son of God, which according to Saul of Tarsus' interpretation of the law was blasphemous. In fact, Saul's zealous reputation preceded him, and he was asked by the Sanhedrin, which was the highest court of the Jewish legal apparatus, to hunt down these Christians and bring them to justice. So as he set out for a city called Damascus, he was blinded by a bright light, and out of this bright light there came a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" So Jesus showed up to Saul of Tarsus and left him radically changed. Now from this point on, his name changes from Saul to Paul, and he becomes one of the foremost defenders of Jesus' resurrection. Now I admit that I'm glossing over a lot of Paul's story, but the point being is that he had spent his entire life working towards one goal. He wanted to become the best Pharisee he could. But his encounter with Jesus left him completely changed, and all of a sudden, he was offered a chance at redemption. Now, this is a similar thread we see at work in the story of Scott Lang and Ant Man. Scott had ended up in jail because he had blew the whistle on a corporate leader, and the movie starts when Scott gets out of jail and is left to pick up the pieces of his life. Now, because he is a criminal, he has a hard time finding a job. Even though he is extremely educated and intelligent, he ends up working at a Baskin-Robbins. Needless to say, he had fallen far from grace. Now, when Hank Pym finds Scott, he gives him a second chance. What we see throughout the Ant-Man movie is that it takes a while for Scott to discover his ability to be Ant-Man. Now, along the way, Hank and his daughter doubt Scott's potential because he continues to fail test after test. But eventually, we see Scott get the hang of being Ant-Man and goes on to excel in his role. It is the same story with Saul of Tarsus. Right after he was blinded, he was sent into the city and told to await a man named Ananias. Now, Ananias was a Christian who had heard of the terrible things that Saul of Tarsus had done, and he wanted no part in helping him. But after God insists, Ananias goes and prays over Saul, and he recovers his sight. Now, you see, Ananias had heard of Saul's reputation and wanted no part in helping him. Scott's criminal record made him undesirable, and nobody wanted to take a chance on him. With both Saul and Scott, we see that their redemption started when someone was willing to give them a second chance. In the case of Scott, it was Hank Pym. In the case of Saul, it was God. So Scott went on to become the hero Ant-Man, the same one that we have come to know and love. And Saul of Tarsus went on to become, the Apostle Paul, who is responsible for most of the New Testament material. Redemption is a powerful thing, especially considering where each character was in their before stories. What once seemed like a wasted life was transformed and used as a means of hope, inspiration, and restoration. That is what happens when we allow God into our stories. God takes what is broken and brings about restoration. God takes what is decaying and brings about healing. God takes what is dead and brings about life. No matter how far you have fallen from grace, you are not too far to be redeemed by God. And that is how Ant Man gives us a beautiful image of the power of restoration. And there you have it. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of Thursday's Theology. If you want your weekly dose of theology, make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you missed last week's episode of Thursday's Theology and want to catch up, click or tap right here to watch that. Otherwise, if you want more theology, head on over to thursdaystheology.com. Once again, I'm Pastor Jeff. Thanks for joining me as we discover who God is, what theology is, and why it all matters. And remember, theology doesn't always have to be difficult. It is simply the study of who God is. Take care. We'll see you next week.